The Trail of Disappearing Sounds. This happened to me in the spring of 2006. I was 15 and my family had just moved to a small town just outside of Aspen, Colorado. Our house was at the very edge of the woods, and behind our backyard was a trail that led deep into the wilderness. It was a well-used path for local hikers and joggers, but the deeper you went, the less traffic there was. I spent most of my time back there exploring with my dog, a golden retriever named Buddy. He was my shadow, always with me, and he loved those woods just as much as I did. He was a big, strong dog, afraid of nothing, or so I thought. One afternoon, I was walking the trail with Buddy, a couple of miles in. It was a clear day, warm and sunny, but a strange, heavy silence had fallen over the forest. The usual chirping of birds and the rustle of squirrels were completely gone. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. The air felt thick and still. I remember feeling a chill, despite the sun on my face. It was the kind of silence that feels wrong, like the woods were holding their breath. Buddy, who was usually trotting ahead, his nose to the ground, suddenly stopped and put his head low. He let out a low, guttural growl I had never heard him make before. His ears were flat against his head, and his hackles were raised, staring intently at something far down the trail. I followed his gaze, but I couldn't see anything. I tried to reassure him, telling him to go on, but he wouldn't budge. He started whimpering and backing up, pressing himself against my legs. He was no longer the confident, happy dog I knew. He was terrified. Just then, I heard a sound. A snapping of a twig, followed by another and another. It wasn't the sound of an animal running. It was a rhythmic, almost mechanical sound, like something large was walking, deliberately and slowly, towards us. The sound was getting closer, moving with an unnatural cadence. I tried to calm Buddy, but he was shaking violently. He started to bark, a high-pitched, panicked yelp that echoed strangely in the dead silence of the woods. The footsteps stopped. The silence returned, even thicker than before.
Where are
Then,
you?
Buddy's barking suddenly cut off. He let out a final, pained cry, and then, nothing. I looked down, and he wasn't there. He was gone. The space he had occupied just a moment ago was empty. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest. I called for Buddy, my voice shaking, but there was no response. The dog I had walked with 100 times, who had never left my side, had simply vanished into thin air. I scrambled back to my house, not even looking behind me. The sound of my own footsteps was the only thing I could hear, a stark contrast to the silence that had swallowed Buddy. When I got home, my parents asked where he was. I couldn't even explain it. I just said he had run off. They searched for days, putting up posters and calling shelters, but he was never found. I never saw him again. I've never gone back into those woods, not even to the very edge of the backyard. And to this day, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was making those sounds not only scared my dog, but took him. Story 2, The Fire Tower. This happened to my grandfather and his younger brother back in 1968. They were both in their late teens and were adventurous kids who loved the mountains. They decided to hike up to a fire tower near a remote mountain pass in the San Juan Mountains. The tower was old and abandoned, but they had heard a rumor that a fire lookout cabin nearby was still in decent shape.
It's pretty cool.
They packed a few things and set off for an overnight trip, eager for a weekend away from their family farm. They reached the cabin just before sunset. It was a small, rustic cabin, but in surprisingly good condition. They set up camp and built a fire outside, looking forward to a peaceful night under the stars. As night fell, the forest became completely still. There was no wind, no sound of animals, nothing. It was the kind of unnatural silence that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. My grandfather said he kept getting this feeling that they weren't alone. even though they were miles from any road or town. It was a sense of being watched, an invisible weight pressing down on them. Just as they were about to turn in for the night, they heard something from the direction of the fire tower, which was about 500 yards away. It was a faint, low hum, like the sound of an old generator or a high-voltage wire.
Did you hear that?
It was an odd sound to hear in the middle of nowhere.
What was that?
They looked at each other, confused, and my grandfather's brother suggested they go check it out. My grandfather said no, that it felt wrong, that they should just stay put. The humming stopped. Then, they heard a new sound, a sound of something heavy dragging itself up the metal steps of the tower. Clang, scrape, clang, scrape. The sound was impossibly slow and deliberate, and it was getting closer. The scraping sound was particularly unsettling, as if whatever was making it didn't have feet or wasn't trying to be quiet. They were both frozen, listening. The dragging continued, getting higher and higher up the tower. They could hear the old metal groaning under a tremendous weight. They didn't have a flashlight strong enough to see the top, so they just sat there, clutching each other's arms, the firelight dancing on their terrified faces. The dragging stopped. For a moment, there was a complete and utter silence. Then, a voice, deep and guttural, boomed from the top of the tower. It wasn't speaking English or any language they recognized. It sounded like a series of long, drawn-out growls and clicks, as if it was trying to imitate human speech but failing horribly. The sounds were alien and full of a terrible, suffocating malevolence. My grandfather and his brother didn't move. They just stared up into the darkness. After a few moments, the dragging started again, this time descending the tower. Clang, scrape, clang, scrape. They grabbed their bags and ran. They didn't stop until they reached their truck and drove off down the winding mountain road. They never looked back. My grandfather told me that the memory of that voice and the sound of whatever was on that tower never left him. He said it was like listening to something ancient and evil, and he knew in his bones that if they had gone to investigate, they would have never made it back. They had a lucky escape from something they couldn't even comprehend. Story 3. The Figures in the Snow. This happened a few years ago when I was on a winter hiking trip with my friend near the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. We had rented a small cabin in a secluded area, and on our second day, we decided to do a long hike up a snowy trail. The weather was perfect, cold and crisp, with a thick layer of untouched powder on the ground. We were the only ones out there, as far as we could tell. The snow was a couple of feet deep, and the air was completely still and cold, with no wind at all. About an hour into our hike, we stopped to take a break. The silence of the snowy woods was profound and beautiful. As we were drinking some water, I looked up the trail and saw something that made me freeze. About 100 yards ahead, partially obscured by some pine trees, were two figures. They were perfectly still, just standing there, facing away from us, as if they were waiting for something. They were tall and unnaturally thin, and they were dressed in dark, heavy coats. What was strange was that they weren't wearing any hats or hoods. Their heads were completely bare, just dark, indistinct shapes against the white snow. I nudged my friend and pointed. He saw them too, and his face went white. We both just stood there, staring. We tried to talk ourselves into a rational explanation. Hikers, maybe? But they weren't moving. They just stood there, motionless, like statues. And the way they were standing, it felt wrong. It felt like they were aware of us, even though their backs were to us. We decided to turn around and head back to the cabin.
Did you hear that?
We moved slowly at first, not wanting to spook whatever they were. We walked for about 5 minutes, and then my friend, who was leading, stopped dead in his tracks.
What do we do?
"Look," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. I looked back, and my blood ran cold. The two figures were gone, but now, about 50 feet away, right beside the trail, was a single set of bare footprints in the snow. They were long and thin, like human footprints, but the toes were unnaturally long, almost like fingers, and there was a third set of prints next to them, as if a third unseen figure had been standing there, just off the trail, watching us. We started walking faster, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. We could hear the sound of the snow crunching behind us, but when we turned, there was nothing, just the trail we had already covered. The sound continued, following us all the way back to the cabin. It was a rhythmic, crunching sound.
Did you hear that?
Not like an animal, but like someone, or something, was walking with the same slow, deliberate pace as the first two figures we had seen. We ran the last half mile, bursting through the door and locking it behind us. We spent the rest of the night huddled inside, listening to the silence of the woods, punctuated by the faint sound of footsteps circling the cabin. We left at dawn and never returned. We never saw what made those footprints, but I know what we saw on that trail wasn't human. Whatever those figures were, they were watching us, and they were in no hurry to show themselves. The feeling of being hunted never left me after that.